When we wrote the Valley Chronicles in 2016, we devoted the last chapter to people moving to the Annapolis Valley from all over the world. And we realized we didn't have to go very far to find people that had moved here. We didn't, I think we did about 6 or 7 families that moved here. And that filled a whole chapter. So when that book was finished, so I said, we could do a whole book on people moving to Nova Scotia. So we did in 2018. People have been coming to Nova Scotia for hundreds of years. Some came to explore, and some came to escape the hardships from the homeland, and some came here just because they heard it was a great place. And people are still coming to Nova Scotia for various reasons, and we welcome them with open arms. There are many stories of people coming from all over the world. They come here on vacation or just drive through, fall in love with the scenery, our way of life, but most of all, it's people. One group of immigrants to Nova Scotia were the war brides. Now, it takes time to find out a lot about these war brides because there are not very much written about the war brides that came to Canada. But however, some 50,000 brides did come to our shores, and there's very little tracking of them coming here, mainly due to this would be during World War I, World War II, but in World War II there was a shortage of shipping, and sometimes war brides were placed on any ship that was coming across the Atlantic. Also, during the winter of 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu was an epidemic stage, and for this reason, a lot of the war brides and their children contacted this influenza aboard the ships halfway across the Atlantic. Some died, some buried at sea, and others died shortly after they came to the Canadian shores. It's too bad because some of these war brides and families never got to experience a new life in Canada. Also, there was the threat of the German U-boats that plagued the Atlantic, but the ones that made a success to our shores landed at Halifax's Pier 21, and some landed in New Brunswick. Pier 21 became famous, and now it's a provincial or federal museum. And Canadian soldiers, married a lot of the European girls, and it's been said that at the war's end, Canadian soldiers were marrying English and European women at the rate of 1,000 per month. Now, during the First World War, the Netherlands remained a neutral country. But during the Second World War, they tried to become neutral, but the Dutch resistance could not stave off the Germans. So by 1944, the Western Allies had tried to liberate Arnhem. Now, Arnhem is a town in the Netherlands, and this is where Hilda lived. And when the first operation to liberate the Netherlands failed, but in 1945, during the late stages of the war, the assault was led by the 49th British Infantry Division, the 5th Canadian Armored Division, the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Navy. And on May the 5th, the town of Arnhem was liberated. But when the war broke out, little Hilda was 14 years old, and they suffered under the German occupation. And when the German forces invaded the cities, the family was basically put out in the streets. She and her family had to live in a chicken coop with 20 other people. Later in life, Hilda was quoted as saying, "We basically lived this way for 18 months, and all we had to eat were raw eggs. And it wasn't for the good grace of the farmers, they would have starved to death." Canadian soldiers eventually liberated Hilda City, and Lawrence Lowe was one of these soldiers. He was from Bridgetown in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley. And Lawrence had enlisted with the Nova Scotia Regiment and arrived in Great Britain in 1939. And Lawrence was attached to the Transport and Supply Division, taking much needed materials and food to the city of Arnhem. And this is how Hilda and Lawrence left. Now, Lawrence was commonly known as Busby. And things developed in a relationship naturally ensued after that, and Lawrence and Hilda got married in 1945. And after the war, they came to settled in Bridgetown and ran a small farm on the outskirts of the town. I want to reference a lady. Her name is Yara Barkova, and she was born in the communist country of Czechoslovakia, and her story is a remarkable one of escape and survival as a refugee in Austria, and now makes her home in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The years of communist rule in Czechoslovakia, from I think 1948 to 1989, were very scary and dismal, and the communists had taken over the country. And at a young age, Yara was married and had a 4-year-old daughter named Eva. And their escape was very dramatic. They had to, if you were caught leaving the country, you were actually put in prison or sent back to your home country. Yara and her 4-year-old daughter Eva came across the Austrian border at midnight, and they were in the trunk of a car. And lucky they weren't caught. And they made it to a refugee camp in Austria. And while they're at this refugee camp, the papers come through for them to immigrate to Canada, and the place of destination was Nova Scotia. And Yara has mentioned to me that when the officials told her they were going to Nova Scotia, her first comment was, "Where the hell is Nova Scotia?" But she found out that Nova Scotia is a very welcoming country, and she remembers when she landed here, the officials took her to Zeller's to get clothing, and she was amazed by the spaces of a store where she could buy anything she wanted. And she loved this. She took courses in aesthetics and eventually opened her own clinic in Halifax. And her daughter, Eva, graduated from high school, went to Dal, and is now a doctor in the home bank. Next, I interviewed Robert Galbraith, who is an international journalist and spends his time in the Vancouver area. And then also in the summers, he spends his time in Briar Island. He's been a world-renowned journalist and has written for magazines such as the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and several other international and national magazines. One of his feature stories was covering the fentanyl crisis in Vancouver's downtown east side. Carrie and Brett Watkins were from BC, and they spent a lot of their time moving in and out of places in BC and were very tired of the high price of living, and they wanted to raise their young family in a country situation and outside the city. And lo and behold, they answered an ad that was run in a Cape Breton newspaper and on the internet. Two sisters from Cape Breton, from Lycogama, ran an ad looking for help in their farm market. The farmer's daughter advertised for workers in exchange for 2 acres of free land if the successful applicant stayed for 5 years. Well, Carrie answered this ad, and lo and behold, she got the job. And they moved from BC to Lycogama. And when I interviewed her, she said, "We definitely see ourselves staying here for the long term." Nancy Godfrey was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Eventually, Nancy ended up working in a showroom as part of the lighting crew in the Las Vegas Strip. And as part of the lighting crew, she ran the follow spot, which is a large lighting instrument that tracks the performer on stage. And as Nancy said, you know, even though you're for a distance from the performer, you do get a close up and develop a personal relationship with the performer during their performance, and you can be a couple hundred feet away. She did this for a number of years, and she worked with such performers as Dolly Parton, Frank Sinatra, Cher, Don Rickles, Dionne Warwick, Kenny Rogers, Willie Nelson, John Denver, Lionel Richie, Paul Anka. But I asked her, I said, what performer did you enjoy working with the most? And she said, Frank Sinatra. Godfrey and her husband ended up in Center Lee, just outside of Bridgetown, and they love it here in the country. Very different from the hustle and bustle of the city in Las Vegas. Valerie and Peter Davis were married in England in 1962, and in 1967 they decided to immigrate to Canada. Landing at the Halifax International Airport, which then was the Kelly Lake Airport, the airport was not really developed, and Peter was quoted as saying, "What the hell am I doing bringing my family to a place like this?" But they fell in love with Nova Scotia and eventually moved to Annapolis Royal, and have made a tremendous impact on the town of Annapolis Royal. Peter is town crier. Valerie's involved in a lot of music and drama in the town. And also, Peter has organized the first World Championship in Conkers, and that has been successful. So, despite some of the negative events of the world in Canada, and even here in the Atlantic provinces, we still live in a pretty darn good part of the country. We here in Nova Scotia are very proud of our distinct and unique heritage, our way of life, and we welcome all newcomers to our province, especially here in the Annapolis Valley.
So, my name is Gareth Hayes, and I moved to Canada in 1987 from England to Bridgetown, Nova Scotia, and I was 6 years old. I started in grade 1, and I was here from 1987 to 1999 when I graduated high school at BRHS. So after I left Nova Scotia, I moved to Toronto in 2001 for college, and I'd never lived anywhere except for Bridgetown, so it was a bit of a culture shock to be around 7 million people, and it's a lot of city and a lot of concrete and a lot of hustle and bustle, but as a 21-year-old, it was very exciting. The beginning, I only missed the people. But after my first trip back to Nova Scotia, after about 3 years of being away and not coming back, then I started to realize how much I missed it here, because the small things I didn't notice before really stood out to me after being gone for so long. I don't miss anything about it. I hated the traffic. I hated the weather. I hated the fact that it took me an hour to do anything, whether it was go to the grocery store or not, and now I can commute to work in 3 minutes, and I can go to the grocery store in 8, and I don't miss anything about it, not one thing. I marvel at the peace and quiet all the time. When I walk out of my house in the morning, I listen to the birds. I go and watch sunsets often once a week if I can, because I can do that within 15 to 20 minutes of my home. Again, you don't really notice how awesome it is until you go and stand and watch the Bay of Fundy and the waves are crashing and the sun's setting, and it doesn't even matter if you go to the busiest campground in Port George. Busiest 4 or 5 people at any given time. And again, the novelty of being here after a year and a half still doesn't wear off. I still listen to the birds in the morning, and I still watch the sunset at night. So, no, there's nothing I regret about it. Not one thing.